Elijah knew how to breathe through tension. He had practiced it since middle school, in locker rooms where slurs flew like spit, in family dinners where silence carved more wounds than words ever could. And now, at 17, he was breathing through it again, only this time. It wasn't a hallway or a classroom. It was the wide concrete of a rest stop parking lot in the middle of the interstate, and red and blue lights were flashing behind him. He had pulled over just 10 minutes ago to stretch his legs. The drive had been long, a blur of cornfields and countdowns in his mind. Today was important. A scholarship interview at the university's LGBTQ outreach program, one of the few places where his voice might actually mean something. He had dressed carefully. Navy hoodie with a subtle pride patch near the hem, clean jeans. His leather folder held 2 letters of recommendation and the essay he had rewritten 6 times. He was early, as always. He had done everything right. But perfection wasn't protection. Not here. A patrol car slid behind his sedan, engine still running. Elijah saw it in the rearview mirror but didn't move. He had nothing to hide, and still his pulse quickened. The officer stepped out slowly. White, mid-40s, the kind of stare that stripped away layers before a word was spoken. He approached the driver's side, hand resting casually near the holstered weapon. Elijah rolled down the window before being asked. Hands visible, breath even, just like his father had taught him. The officer didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask if Elijah was okay. He asked why someone like him was parked alone, with a bag that looked suspicious. Elijah blinked, confused. The bag was from his school, inside laptop, charger, trail mix, a copy of Giovanni's room. But he didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said he was on his way to an academic interview and had stopped to check directions. That was all. The officer didn't look convinced. He circled the car, muttering something under his breath. Moments later, a second cruiser pulled in. A woman stepped out, younger, quiet, uncertain. 2 officers, 1 teenager, and still, Elijah kept breathing. They asked to see his ID. He handed it over, hand steady. Then they asked if they could search his car. He hesitated. That pause was enough. The older officer said something about obstruction, about probable cause, about uncooperative behavior. He was told to step out. People started watching. A trucker sipping coffee, a woman walking her dog, and someone standing farther off with a phone raised. Elijah stepped out. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't even speak. He let them open his trunk, let them unzip his backpack. When they pulled out a small rainbow pin from the inside pocket, the officer smirked. Figure, he muttered. Elijah felt the sting, not just in the insult, but in the normalcy of it. As if being called out for who he was should feel routine, they turned him around. The cuffs clicked. His cheeks burned, not from shame, but disbelief. And still, he said nothing, except one thing, one sentence. Before being led to the cruiser, he looked over his shoulder and said, "My father will want to know about this." The officers laughed. "Yeah," the man sneered. "Let him." They didn't ask who his father was. They didn't check the badge number on the ID. They didn't know they were cuffing the son of one of the most respected judges in the state. They didn't know that the quiet boy they were escorting in broad daylight would become the spark to ignite a fire they couldn't control. But someone had seen, and someone had recorded. And the internet was never slow when injustice looked like this. Stay tuned to Heart Story for part 2 of Elijah's journey, because silence doesn't mean surrender, and dignity doesn't end with handcuffs. Elijah sat alone in the small, windowless room inside the county precinct. The fluorescent light above him buzzed with a steady hum, cold and sterile. His wrists still bore faint red lines from the cuffs, even after they'd been removed. He hadn't cried. He hadn't shouted. He had simply waited. That somehow made the officers more suspicious. The older one, Sergeant Delaney, paced outside the door, mumbling to himself. The younger one, Officer Kim, hovered near the desk, shifting weight between her feet. She had watched Elijah from the corner of her eye the entire ride back. She had noticed his silence, the dignity in his posture. Something about him didn't add up, but not in the way Delaney kept insisting. Delaney had scribbled notes for a vague report, uncooperative. Possible narcotics, refused consent to search. None of it was true, but for now, it sat in a manila folder with Elijah's name on it. They hadn't let him make a phone call. He'd asked politely, clearly 3 times. Each time, the request had been brushed aside with a hand wave or a muttered, "Not now." What they didn't realize was that Elijah's silence was not fear. It was calculation. He knew better than to escalate. He had seen what escalation looked like on the news, in protests, in statistics. What they also didn't realize was that his father had already seen the video. Across town, Judge Malcolm Rivers had just ended a policy roundtable with a state governor. His assistant had shown him the TikTok clip on a phone. Her face pale. It was only 27 seconds long, but it showed enough. Elijah, hands raised. The officer's voice calling him. One of those confused kids. The moment the cuffs clicked, and the look in Elijah's eyes, not rage, not panic, just the deep, exhausted ache of someone who had seen it coming. Malcolm stood completely still. He didn't shout, didn't panic. He simply turned to his aide and said, "Tell the car we're going to the station." Back at the precinct, Officer Kim glanced again through the window. Elijah hadn't moved. She looked down at the ID they had taken from him. Elijah Rivers. The name echoed in her mind. There was something about it. She pulled up a browser on the desk terminal and typed in the full name. A list of articles appeared: academic awards, public speaking competitions, a recent scholarship finalist list, and one local feature: son of Judge Malcolm Rivers prepares for National LGBTQ Youth Panel. Her fingers froze on the mouse. Delaney returned with 2 coffees in hand, muttering something about paperwork. She didn't say a word. She simply minimized the window, but the shift had begun. Outside, the front desk phone rang again. Another call from someone asking about the teenage boy who got arrested at a rest stop. The receptionist didn't know what to say. Online to memo. The video had crossed 500,000 views in just 2 hours. Under the caption, "Gay teen arrested for standing alone." Comments poured in. "He didn't even raise his voice. Why search his car?" Someone find out who this kid is. They were already finding out. At the station's main entrance, Judge Malcolm Rivers stepped out of the black sedan, straightening his coat. He didn't need to announce himself. Faces shifted the moment he entered, but he didn't ask to see his son. Not yet. He asked to speak with the station commander. Inside, Elijah still waited. He sat with his back straight, his folder unopened in his lap, thumb resting over the edge of his scholarship letter. He didn't know what time it was. He didn't know if they'd let him go. He didn't know that justice had just walked through the front door. He only knew one thing. He wouldn't let this moment define him. And somewhere, deep in the halls of that precinct, someone had finally started checking his name. The station buzzed with its usual sounds, clicking keyboards, murmured updates, radios crackling low in the background. But something had changed. The energy was tighter, uneasy, like a room holding its breath. Judge Malcolm Rivers stood quietly in the office of the precinct commander, his face unreadable. He had not raised his voice. He didn't need to. His name alone carried more weight than anything the officers had written in their vague incident report. The commander flipped through the file with rising discomfort. Everything about it was thin. No citation, no charge, no consent form. Only phrases like possible intent and non-compliance, phrases often used to justify more than they should. Meanwhile, in the small holding room down the hall, Elijah remained seated. He hadn't been informed his father had arrived. No one had said anything, but something in the air had shifted. Even behind the locked door, he could feel it. Officer Kim sat at her desk, staring at the monitor, not moving. The search she had started earlier was still open. She had read 3 different articles now. She knew who Elijah was. She also knew Sergeant Delaney hadn't bothered to look. The video had reached 1 million views before noon, uploaded by a college student passing through the rest stop. The clip had spread from TikTok to Instagram to national Twitter threads in less than 6 hours. The caption was short but powerful. He didn't fight, he didn't shout, he just stood there, and they cuffed him anyway. The visual was striking. Elijah's face, quiet and composed, his hands behind his back, the rainbow patch barely visible on his hoodie. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't violent, it was calm. And that calm made it harder to ignore. Comments flooded in, "I've been that kid." His silence says everything. Why are we still here in 2025? Journalists picked it up. Civil rights pages began reposting. Activists clipped the video alongside headlines from years past, different names. Same pattern, but this time the story had a new variable: Elijah's last name. By the time local news ran a segment at noon, the anchor's tone had changed. They no longer referred to him as a teen involved in an altercation. They called him the son of a sitting state judge. Inside the station, the walls felt closer. No one joked anymore. No one leaned back in their chairs. Delaney, who had returned from lunch oblivious to the media storm, barely made it 2 steps before being called upstairs. When he entered the commander's office and saw Malcolm Rivers sitting there, he froze. His face drained of color. The commander said nothing at first, just pushed the folder forward and asked one question. "Did you ever verify his ID?" Delaney opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Downstairs, Elijah was finally told he could leave. No apology, no explanation, just a plain instruction. "You're free to go." He stood, adjusted his hoodie, picked up the folder that had sat unopened on his lap for hours. The letter inside was still crisp, still waiting. He didn't speak, didn't ask why. He just walked toward the exit until a familiar voice cut through the hallway. "Elijah!" He turned. His father stood there, calm as ever, with a slight nod. There was no lecture, no scolding, no dramatic hug, just the silent exchange between two people who had lived enough to know some things didn't need to be said. They walked out of the station together, side by side. Outside, cameras had already gathered. Protesters had begun forming across the street. Signs were being raised. "Queer is not a crime." "Let Elijah speak." Elijah didn't wave. He didn't hide. He simply walked past them with quiet resolve. In the car, he finally opened his folder. The letter was still intact. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "I'm still going. They don't get to take that." His father looked over and nodded once. "You still have a future, and it starts now." That night, the video crossed 2 million views, and the governor's office released a statement confirming that Elijah Rivers was scheduled to appear in front of the State Scholarship Committee the next morning with full security escort. But the story wasn't fading. It was just beginning, and the courtroom wasn't far behind. The courtroom was full, but silent. Not because anyone told them to be, because everyone understood what this moment meant. It had been 3 days since the video of Elijah went viral. 3 days since a teenager in a navy hoodie became the face of a storm no one could contain. Now, beneath the arched ceilings of the state judicial chamber, he sat in the front row, his hands resting on his lap. The rainbow patch on his sleeve was still there. So were the faint marks on his wrists. Behind him, reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Legal observers watched every move. Activists filled the gallery benches, their signs silent now, but still tucked at their feet. At the front of the room, the panel of 3 judges sat beneath the state seal. In the center was Judge Malcolm Rivers. There had been questions about whether he should preside. Was it personal? Was it conflict of interest? But after a full review, the governor's legal counsel cleared him, not because he was a father, but because he was a man known for clarity and restraint. He hadn't asked to be the one in this seat, but now that he would not waver. This wasn't about revenge. This was about responsibility. Sergeant Delaney sat at the defense table, his hands clenched tight. His uniform looked pressed, but his face looked hollow. Officer Kim sat beside him, eyes low. No one had smiled since walking in. The hearing was not about guilt or innocence. It was about conduct, about whether what happened to Elijah that morning had violated both legal protocol and basic human decency. The room watched as body cam footage played again. The audio was clear, the search without consent, the dismissive tone, the mocking words, and Elijah's voice barely raised above a whisper asking to call his father. It rang differently now. Judge Rivers didn't flinch as it played. His gaze never left the screen. When it ended, he turned to the two officers. "We are not here," he said, "to relive public embarrassment. We are here to evaluate truth." A witness was called, the college student who had filmed the video. She confirmed what everyone had already seen. Elijah had not resisted, had not provoked, had not even raised his tone. Then came Officer Kim. She stood slowly. Her voice was soft but steady. She admitted she had doubts that morning, admitted she hadn't verified the ID, even after seeing the name. "I should have asked more questions," she said. "I didn't. I was afraid of making trouble." Her voice cracked once, but she didn't look away. Finally, Delaney was asked to speak. He tried to defend the decision, said the situation had felt off, that the teen wasn't acting normally. "What do you mean by normally?" one judge asked. Delaney hesitated. He couldn't answer. Another judge leaned forward. "Did you find any illegal items?" "No," he replied. "Was he armed?" "No." "Did he ever threaten you?" "No." Silence followed. Long, heavy. Then Judge Rivers spoke. "The law does not bend to suspicion. It does not excuse bias, and it does not permit silence to be treated as guilt." The sentence settled like weight across the room. From the gallery, Elijah watched his father not as a parent, but as a symbol of something stronger than an apology, stronger than anger, something the world often forgot: integrity. By late afternoon, the hearing closed. The panel would deliberate overnight, but everyone already knew. Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with students, parents, and strangers holding candles. Not for mourning, for witness, for a boy who refused to shout back, for a man who judged with dignity, and for a system that, if only for a moment, had looked itself in the mirror. The courtroom doors opened again the next morning. Sunlight poured across the polished floor as Elijah stepped inside, this time not as a defendant, not as a headline, but as a voice. He had been invited, officially, to speak before the panel concluded, not as a witness, not as evidence, but as someone the system had tried to silence, and who chose to speak anyway. He walked to the front slowly, calmly, the same navy hoodie, the same folder in hand, but something in his posture had shifted. Not just courage, clarity. Judge Rivers looked up as his son took the stand. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He simply gave a small nod, and then Elijah began. "I was arrested," he said, "for standing still, for looking a certain way, for being who I am." His voice was measured, each word deliberate. The room held its breath again. "They searched my car for no reason. They ignored my ID. They took away my voice because they didn't think it mattered." He paused, looked at the officers seated in the corner. "But I wasn't the only one watching that day. Thousands of others were, too. People like me. People like the officer I didn't get to call. My father." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "I don't want them fired." Elijah continued, his voice steady. "I want them educated. I want training. I want accountability. And I want them to hear me." He turned toward Officer Kim, who lifted her eyes for the first time. "You stayed silent, but now you know how that silence feels. Don't let it happen again." Then he turned toward Delaney. "You thought I was weak because I didn't yell, but restraint is not weakness. It's power." His final words came slowly, as if carved from stone. "I didn't come here to win. I came to remind you dignity is not yours to give or take. It belongs to all of us. He stepped down, walked back to his seat. The entire room stayed still. The panel of judges read their decision. Both officers were found to have violated procedural protocol and acted on personal bias. They were suspended without pay, required to complete a new training program on bias recognition and civil rights. Delaney's past 10 years of cases would be audited. Officer Kim was given a chance to stay with the condition that she publicly testify before the new training academy. The ruling was firm, but it wasn't punishment. It was precedent. A week later, Elijah stood outside the state law enforcement training facility, not in protest, in purpose. He had been invited to speak at the graduation of the first cadets trained under the new reforms that bore his name. He wore the same hoodie, he unfolded the same folder, and he read the same scholarship letter he once thought he'd never get to submit. When he stepped to the podium, a sea of new recruits stood at attention. "I was once treated like a threat," Elijah said. "Now, I speak to those who will decide what threat means." He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. It walks in quietly, stands with its back straight, and lets the world catch up. As he stepped down, a young cadet barely older than he was raised his hand in salute. "Thank you, sir," the cadet said softly. Elijah simply nodded, then turned toward the light and walked forward. What does justice mean to you when no one's watching? If Elijah's story moved you, share it, and follow Heart Story for more powerful true stories that remind us silence isn't weakness. It's a choice until it's a voice.